Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, so I was surprised to be invited by Jacob to talk about DMN because the inventors of DMN are here in this room, but I was not one of them. I was off doing business process management and process modeling with BPMN while they were doing that. But it turns out that that background is actually relevant to my talk today because DMN is trying now to replicate the success of BPMN a decade ago. And whether DMN is able to succeed or fail there depends, I believe, largely on whether its implementers heed the lessons of BPMN. So, Object Management Group, OMG, is a standards organization, and they measure success of their standards by breadth of adoption. And by that measure, BPMN is extremely successful, widely adopted by both business users and technical users. And in fact, adoption by business users who are notoriously averse to standards, period, was from the beginning an explicit goal of BPMN, as it is today for DMN. So what I really should have called this talk is DMN as a business-friendly, tool-independent, and fully executable decision modeling language, because those qualities are essential to its fundamental promise, which is first, business users, this language is for you. Second, it works the same in any tool. And third, probably most important, what you model is what you execute. And that is really a powerful promise because it's intended to enable business users to actually define and maintain the decision logic that drives their operations themselves, as opposed to the traditional practice of creating requirements handed off to programmers who actually know nothing themselves about the decision logic. And this is a disruptive promise because if and when DMN succeeds, it will totally transform the practice of decision management and will also transform the competitive landscape for decision management software. That's the if and when. Now, this combination of tool independence and executability is a tough one because it means that there needs to be standardization of an expression language. And this was basically one of the key issues in the DMN standard. DMN, in the end, invented its own, called FEEL, along with a tabular format for decision logic called boxed expressions that essentially assembles these expressions into something analogous to program statements. So both of these things, FEEL and boxed expressions, are critical, I believe, to DMN achieving its promise, and the struggle over implementing them is really central to my talk today. All right, so my talk really has three parts. Part one, the promise, is going to give a little background on what DMN is and what achieving the promise entails. Part two is sort of a brief tutorial about how the language works, shows how a decision model created entirely graphically through diagrams and tables can be executable on an engine. And part three, meeting the implementation challenge, is going to discuss some of the issues, problems that 3 months ago, when I started putting this talk together, convinced me that there was no way that DMN would ever be able to succeed in this. And it'll conclude with some recent developments that now have me convinced that, yes, indeed, it will succeed. In fact, by the end of this year, we'll have multiple products out there that fully implement the standard. So quite a change in the last 3 months. All right, so as I said, 3 months ago when I started thinking about this talk, it seemed unlikely that DMN would be able to fulfill this promise, because even the objective, as laid out in the spec of fully empowering business users to define and manage their own decision logic, was not widely shared among its key implementers. That is, the vendors active in the DMN task force. So maybe they said DMN shouldn't try to do that. It should just be a better requirements gathering, standard. So requirements were typically gathered in text documents, and this will be model-based, so it'll be better. That will improve current practice and certainly a lot easier to implement. And there are others who said, well, we can do more than that, and we should do more than that. We should allow business users to create executable decision logic in addition to requirements. But, hey, they're business users, so that decision logic has to be really simple. So we will restrict the decision logic that they can create to basically very simple decision tables. Now, in fact, the DMN spec, recognizing this diversity of opinion, actually endorses this idea of partial implementation by defining 3 levels of conformance to the standard. So conformance level 3 is the real thing, including field, boxed expressions, decision requirements. And so it provides all 3 legs, business friendliness, tool independence, executability, required for a stable platform, and strength, because FEEL is actually a quite feature-rich language. Conformance level 2 is the people in favor of that said, we want a stable platform, but it doesn't need to be that strong. So we're going to restrict, because business people aren't ready for FEEL. So we're going to take a tiny subset of FEEL called simple FEEL or SFEEL, basically just decision tables that can select from an enumerated list and basic arithmetic, and allow that. And if you want to go farther than that, well, you need to write requirements for programmers in some other language. And there were still others who said, business users, they don't want to think about decision logic at all. They just should write requirements. Let's leave the decision logic to the programmers. And so that has business friendliness and tool independence, but no executability, so you can't verify it, you can't test it. So that's what I call a two-legged stool. We know how well those work. I would say there's another level that wasn't even anticipated by the spec. I call it 2A, which defines a business-friendly, feature-rich decision logic language that's owned by the tool or used by the tool, not FEEL, some other language. So it's business-friendly, it's executable, but not tool independent. So I would say that is another two-legged stool and really not what we're trying to do. So I say that 3 months ago, fulfilling the promise seemed unlikely because only among the vendors active in the task force in OMG, only one, Oracle, who invented FEEL and box expressions, seemed to have any interest at all in implementing those things. The others said it was just too hard. Besides, the level 1, level 2 were a big step forward from current practice, which was, like I said, just delivering requirements to programmers in some other rule language. And it wasn't just that these vendors were saying it's a faster way to get our tool to market. They were saying, no, this is a viable long-term strategy. And I found that consensus, I'd say it was a consensus, really disappointing because, having spent a long time developing all this stuff, it was a little disconcerting that people were not inclined to implement it. And also the lesson of BPMN is that strategy does not work. The strategy that works is called what you model is what you execute. That was proven. So we need to get back to that in DMN. And then suddenly, in April, things started to change. So at my conference, BPM Next, Oracle demonstrated for the first time their tool that had FEEL boxed expressions implemented. First time anyone had ever seen a tool do this. And one other vendor told me just recently, when I saw that, the light bulb went off, because it's one thing to read about this stuff in a spec, another thing to see how it works in a tool. And yeah, this started to make sense. And then Tricitech, another vendor, modeling tool vendor, demonstrated their implementation of a tool that could draw all the boxed expression types, very nice, and sort of type in the FEEL expressions, although it couldn't execute more than the level 2 decision tables. Sapiens, is Larry here? I guess he's not here. He's coming. Sapiens, known for their own decision language called the decision model, TDM, even flashed up a DRD and said that they were planning to implement a DMN modeler, including FEEL. And the Workflow Management Coalition, which is another BPM standards group, announced that they were going to lead an effort to basically develop what they thought then was a reference implementation, has evolved into a TCK, but tools to help other vendors develop full DMN level 3 products. So from a dead stop, all of a sudden the wheels were turning. And here at this conference, we've seen additional information, additional developments, and I really think after this conference, the vendors that were planning on this partial implementation will begin to rethink their strategy, which only works when no one else is doing the real thing, and now that's not the case. So to understand this promise, we need to take a closer look at the problem that DMN is intended to solve. So a decision describes the logic of the decision model describes the logic of a business decision in terms of a set of rules applied to various inputs. You provide specific values to the inputs, and the decision logic determines the value of the output. So that's really all it does. And Jacob keeps telling me, well, what DMN should do is let you apply constraints to the inputs and some goal to the output and solve for the optimum input set, maybe optimum rule set that gives you the best output value. And that's a really interesting problem. That's a really interesting problem. But that's not what DMN does. DMN just says, give me values for the inputs, I'll give you a value for the output. Yeah, so that's kind of pedestrian, but it's the logic that determines whether your mortgage is approved, the price you pay for your insurance, whether you get that business class upgrade. So, it's actually used a lot. Decision modeling comes down to basically to defining the inputs and the decision rules and their dependencies on other inputs and rules. So now for many years, what we call decision management was called business rules management, and the change in terminology and DMN's association with that change really signifies a break from traditional practice, and maybe even still the dominant practice in this field, which asks the business users to start by going off, hunting down, and harvesting all the rules that are buried in their application systems and the policy manuals and their analytical models and the heads of experts, all this stuff, to harvest all these rules, write them down in these requirements documents that are then given to programmers in some rule language to code into decision logic. But I think you can see that this procedure is going to lead to a lot of user acceptance failures, and so there's a lot of repeated cycles of this. So I think you see some of the problems here. Efficiency. So starting by hunting down, harvesting all the rules is not very efficient because a relatively small fraction of the rules that you harvest are actually relevant to the decisions that you want to implement. The whole notion of text-based decision requirements is vague. They're not verifiable, not testable for completeness, consistency. So there's a problem there. The whole notion of rule languages being proprietary to a single tool leads to this problem of lock-in to a vendor, which translates into higher costs of support and maintenance and training and all those other things. And these repeated cycles of coding and acceptance testing and redefining the requirements and recoding, all those cycles leads to a lack of business agility. And business agility is kind of the main thing that the business cares about today. So this was considered a problem. So about 10 years ago, this term decision management came in as sort of an antidote to the old way of doing business rules management. And James Taylor was one of the leaders of that. Here's his decision management manifesto, although I see it's called Decision Management Manifesto. Not sure what that means. But he coined this mantra, decisions first. The idea being that instead of going off and harvesting all the rules, the business should understand what decisions it wants to make, what information those decisions require, and the rules would follow from that. And that would seem like a good idea. Then Bart von Halle and Larry Goldberg attacked the idea of text-based decision requirements, saying, no, we want to create model-based decision requirements. Business users, sort of dismissed by a lot of people as sort of hopeless, could create really good decision requirements if you gave them modeling tools that were properly designed, properly formatted with a defined methodology and guardrails and formats. And this approach, which they call the decision model, or TDM, proved very successful, where the business users themselves were modeling and maintaining the decision logic, even in very large-scale production implementations. Now, TDM was really about modeling the logic of a single decision, or what DMN would call single decision service. In his book, Alan Fish extended this idea to what I call end-to-end decision logic that could be composed out of multiple decision services, separated in time, intermixed with human decisions and external decisions. You could still have an end-to-end logic in something, in a diagram like this that shows the dependencies of one decision on the other. So that was a great innovation as well. Now, all of these things proved successful in improving the practice of decision management, particularly among business users, but they all suffered from the idea of that the nature of decision modeling was tool specific. And if you wanted something which didn't depend on the tool, you needed a standard. So that's where DMN came in. So DMN stands for Decision Model and Notation. So the and is an OMG thing. And it means that in addition to the notation, the graphical language, there is also a formal meta-model described as a set of UML class diagrams, you see on the left here, that define precisely the names of the elements in the diagram, the relationship to other elements, and it defines an XML schema for the model, and which is precisely aligned to these definitions, so that this model is not just a sketch of the end-to-end decision logic, but actually, when you serialize it in XML, an executable form of it. So have to think about that for a minute. So you have a decision model, which is a diagram of the decision logic end-to-end, even if it has multiple steps. And each decision in that diagram has decision logic, also defined graphically in these tabular formats called boxed expressions. And you can serialize that model in XML, deploy that XML to an engine, and execute the end-to-end logic. And business people can define this. That's a little, mind-blowing, I think. Here's the best part, that the meaning of the diagrams and tables does not change based on the tool that created it. It's the same. Okay, it's the same. So the meaning does not depend on the tool. So you provide it with values of the input data, and the tool can execute the entire DRD and give you values for all the decision nodes in it. Now, for high volume production, you still might want to export this, map this to some production class business rule engine today, or in the next year. But I would say long term, there will be production scale native DMN engines as well, so you won't even need to do that. All right, now you can have all the diagrams and tables you want, but to really make it executable, you need to standardize the expression language. And now we're getting to the heart of the matter, because that expression language needs to be both business-friendly and rich enough to handle the full load of real-world decision logic. And the original DMN task force, which I was not part of, struggled with this, went round and round on this. Some people were against any expression language at all. Some thought their own existing language is the best. Some wanted Excel formula language. In the end, Gary Hallmark from Oracle won the day with FEEL, a new language invented and described in the spec that was both purportedly business-friendly and rich, certainly feature-rich, and this format called boxed expressions that assembled the FEEL expressions into something like a programming language. So DMN is defined by the standard. It's really 5 things rolled into one. These decision requirements diagrams, a standard format for decision tables, a standard expression language called FEEL, the standard tabular format for decision logic called boxed expressions, and the XML serialization based on this meta model. So it's all 5 of these things. Partial implementation, this conformance level 1, just says we just need the first one of these, so it's much easier to do, obviously. And conformance level 2 just says we need the first 2. And as I said 3 months ago, except for Oracle, all the vendors were saying we're either doing conformance level 1 or conformance level 2. But that leaves out a lot. So conformance level 3 is the real thing. But there's a complication, because the DMN spec does not require implementation, does not require FEEL or box expressions. It's just the default. It says you can use some other language. I don't know why they did that. Maybe it was a compromise to get FEEL accepted in the first place. But when you go to some other language, you know, people say, well, it works. Yes, of course it works. I mean, anything can be made to work. It's not tool independent anymore, so it kind of breaks the magic. So conformance level 3 is only defined in terms of FEEL. So if you put in UEL or some other expression language, it can maybe do similar things, but it's not the standard anymore. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I've seen this movie before with BPMN. So BPMN originally, back in 2003, was just a diagramming notation. It was not executable. And the BPM vendors, leading BPM vendors at that time, IBM, Oracle, SAP, thought that was okay because BPMN, the diagram language, could be easily mapped to another language called BPEL, execution language. It was actually a standardized execution language. It was pretty similar. But by 2008, it was clear that customers did not agree, because there were things you could draw in BPMN that could not be executed in BPEL, and vice versa. And so that broke the magic. The magic of the promise was what you model is what you execute, and it wasn't true. And so that was actually the beginning of the end for BPEL in BPM. And so those same vendors, Oracle, IBM, SAP, rushed off to OMG to create BPMN 2.0 that unified the modeling language and the execution language in a single language. And that worked. So with BPMN 2.0, what you model is what you execute. And that worked. And it totally transformed the practice of BPM and the BPM software landscape. So suddenly you had new startups doing BPMN tools. You had open source BPMN implementations. It totally changed the landscape. IBM, who was the #1 vendor in that space at the time, essentially walked away from their own BPEL-based product in favor of a tiny BPMN-based acquisition, probably 10% the size of its own business, and said, okay, you do that now. So it totally transformed the industry. The magic being what you model is what you execute. Now, some vendors possibly fear, DMN vendors possibly fear that, well, if level 3 FEEL implementation, let's say it was some open source FEEL box expression implementation that was available to anybody, they fear they would be commoditized out of business before the market even got off the ground. But I don't really agree with that, because there is a huge amount of value not touched by the DMN standard at all. For example, DMN does not provide any kind of graphical interface for modeling data. It does not provide a business glossary. It does not do anything about constraint rules. It does not say anything about methodology or governance or logic testing and analysis. It doesn't say anything about access to physical data. or execution at all. Fault handling, performance. All those things are outside of the spec, and these are the things that real tools are going to compete and succeed or fail on. Even if there was, at the core, a common language and runtime for that expression language shared by all tools. So, excuse me, those fears, I think, are misplaced. Okay. So with that as background, let's talk about how the language works. First, what's a decision? So as we said, it's a determination of an output or conclusion fact value for a given set of condition set fact values. Where BPMN uses the term variable instead of fact, so a fact is a variable with a specified domain of allowed values. And in DMN, each decision is comprised of a variable which holds the output value and a so-called value expression, the logic that determines the value. So DMN's value expressions are based on rules, decision rules. If condition 1 is true and condition 2 is true, then the output value is X. So decision rules are a class of business rules, but not all business rules are decision rules. So, excuse me, constraint rules, for example, are not decision rules. Decision requirements. So going all the way back to James Taylor's manifesto, we know that decisions require information in the form of other decisions and input data. And so DMN defines something called a decision requirements graph, which is the network of all the requirements, all the supporting decisions and input data required for any decision in the model. And there's something called a decision requirements diagram, which is a visualization of that graph. And in that diagram, the rectangles are called decision nodes, and the ovals are called input data, source data. And the solid arrows here, called information requirements, define those relationships. And they also define the variables in scope for any value expression. So in this decision, make sure I get the right, in this decision, affordability rating, the only variables in scope are applicant and monthly payment, because those are the two nodes connected by these solid arrows, information requirements. Now the DRDs also provide additional information. The rectangles with the clip corners, called business knowledge models, or BKMs, represent reusable fragments of decision logic that are invoked as functions by one or more decisions. And the wavy bottom shapes, like here, called knowledge sources, are really decorations of the diagram, representing kind of the basis for the logic, such as a policy document or analytical model, something like that. Now, BKMs, it turns out, are somewhat controversial. We talked a little about that yesterday at the DecisionCAMP. The way they're displayed in the diagram, sort of as peers with the node that invokes them, is not that popular, and a lot of tools don't use them at all. But in DMN 1.1, the spec actually requires a BKM, at least in the model itself, whether it's in the diagram or not, to be defined whenever you've got reusable logic or iterated logic. That's the way the standard works today. Now, this example here illustrates the mechanics of a DRD. And so let's look at this decision called pre-bureau affordability. It has three inputs: pre-bureau risk category, a decision, applicant data, input data, and required monthly installment. So the logic of pre-bureau affordability can only depend on these three variables. This decision here invokes a BKM called affordability calculation. So what happens is this dashed arrow called a knowledge requirement effectively in the invocation maps the three input variables that I just showed you to the parameters of this function. And then it invokes this function. It turns out that this function invokes another function here, credit contingency factor table. And when affordability calculation gets its answer, it passes it back. It becomes the output value of pre-bureau affordability. So this explanation is kind of tedious, but all of that is implied by these simple arrows here. All right. Now, here on the left, you see a sort of fragment of the meta model for decision nodes. So here you see the relationship in UML between what a decision element in DMN means and the various other things that it relates to, the information requirements, the variable that stores the data, the expression, or the value expression, etc. And on the right, you see XML conforming to the schema that is based on this meta model. So this meta model and schema is what makes the pictorial representation of your model executable on an engine. Now, the most common decision logic format in DMN is called decision table. Decision tables are familiar from decades of use. DMN defines standardization of that, of the formats and the semantics and the syntax of the various elements. Various layouts are allowed. This is the most common, called rules as rows, in which the columns represent inputs and outputs. The header row names the inputs and the outputs, and below that, each row represents a decision rule. The cells, the input cells in the rules are called input entries, and when you combine that, what it says with the header name, that defines a Boolean expression that could be true or false, and if all the expressions in a rule are true, the decision table selects the output expressions as the table output value. If more than one rule matches, that's what this code here called the hit policy determines. So it's essentially rules for resolving cases where more than one rule could match in a decision table. So that's DMN decision tables. Now, decision tables and other forms of value expressions contain expressions in the form of text. And to be fully executable and tool-independent, DMN requires that requires a standard expression language, and so that's FEEL, which was settled on after long and contentious debate. As I said, some people thought it should be Excel. They thought, and they still say, well, FEEL's too, it's not business friendly. So, well, what would be business friendly? Well, Excel formula language, that's sort of by definition business friendly. I'm not sure if that's the case. So here, consider this rule in natural language. If risk is low or medium and payment to income ratio PTI is less than 0.3, then approved, else declined. That's everybody, any business user would sort of know what that meant. So here it is in Excel. Equals if parenthesis and parenthesis or parenthesis risk equals medium, comma, risk equal low, parenthesis, comma. You see it? Here it is in FEEL. If risk in the list, low, medium, and PTI less than 0.3, then approved, else declined. It's almost the same as the natural language. So for simple rules, feels very simple, much better than Excel. So feels only complicated when the logic expression is complicated. So if a business user doesn't want to do those things, they don't need to do them, and no other language is going to make it any easier for them. All right, now, one reason why FEEL in reality has not been readily adopted is that parsing it is very hard. Since the variable names can contain spaces, they can contain other symbols. So making FEEL easier to implement is actually a current topic in DMN 1.2. We had a face-to-face meeting here on Tuesday, and I'd say prior to that, all attempts to make implementation simpler had been rejected as being unfriendly to business, but there's actually some movement now to make it more implementable with very minor changes on the business friendliness. So I think that's really going to be a positive development. So in spite of this difficulty, which has prevented people up to now from implementing it, it's clear to me already that by the end of this year we will have several tools that fully implement FEEL. All right, now, like other languages, FEEL is formally defined in the spec as a grammar, EBNF format. So you see a snippet of that. FEEL is a strongly typed language. It has a small number of base types, and users can define, modelers can define custom types based on those. FEEL has a very rich set of built-in functions, a subset essentially of the XPath 2.0 built-in functions and operators, including the ability to define custom functions, expressions, filter expressions that allow table queries and joins within FEEL. For example, the expression order.item bracket price less than 100 means select from the variable order all child elements item for which the attribute price is less than 100. So it's a very sort of terse way to say that. It can perform sorting, if then else, iteration, lots of other really powerful things. So that means you don't have to exit DMN, go into, say, BPMN to do iteration. You don't have to exit DMN, go into SQL to do table queries and joins. You can do it right from your FEEL expression. But the richness of the language is surely another reason why implementing it has been difficult. So FEEL is just an expression language. It just provides a value. It's an expression that provides a value. So if you want executable language, you need something like statements. You need something that can create variables and assign values to variables. And DMN does that also graphically using these things called boxed expressions. So decision tables are one form of boxed expressions, but most boxed expressions are really these two-column things, where the left column names a variable, and the right column is a FEEL value expression, which is normally something quite simple, just a simple mapping. But it could be sort of a more complex expression like this. It could even be a whole decision table. So the value expression in the right column can nest another, let's say, an invocation of a BKM, a decision table, something more complicated. So this top diagram is the boxed expression for invoking a BKM, called a boxed invocation, where the parameters are listed variables in the left column, and the right is the mapping of the inputs of that decision to the parameters of the invoked BKM. This one on the bottom is called a context, which is, think of it as multi-line, multi-statement decision logic for a value expression for a single decision, where these the left column are essentially local variables defined within the scope of that decision only, that then can be used to simplify the ultimate value expression, which just references here. It's just those local variables. So contexts are a way to take complex decision logic and define it more simply within a single decision mode. All right, so let's recap. DMN includes 5 key elements: DRDs, decision tables, XML serialization, FEEL, and boxed expressions. To realize the promise, the full promise, that is a visual description of the decision logic using just diagrams and tables, tool independence, but with full executability, what you model is what you execute. You need all 5 of these things. Partial implementation, conformance level 1 or 2, means giving up on some of these 5 things, but also giving up on the promise. You don't have that anymore. So now, the important thing here is to understand that DMN allows you to define an end-to-end decision model completely graphically, diagrams and tables. And that pictorial representation has a completely equivalent XML representation. You don't need to be given both. You can generate one from the other, and vice versa. So either one will do. So you can define it graphically, serialize it in XML, and then deploy that XML to a suitable engine, and it will execute it. So that's a pretty cool thing. All right, so let's talk about the challenge of it. So implementing DMN level 3 requires the ability to draw the boxed expressions, all the forms of it, including contexts that nest other contexts, decision tables, and it requires the ability to parse, validate, and execute FEEL. So if those things were easy, we'd have lots of DMN tool level 3 out there today, but they're not. So I've been using the term executable, but what I really mean is that the modeling tool must be able to, does not mean that the DMN tool, modeling tool, must include a production class runtime engine. It just means, I just mean that the tool needs to be able to display to the modeler the output value of any node in the DRD given complete set of input data values. So for the purpose of testing, analysis, etc., so that even if this is exported to some other rule engine later, the logic has been fully vetted and analyzed. So we're really talking about test data, logical data, not access to physical data. And those things are really important. I think Larry's going to talk about that next. So if you need to deal with large data sets in production, yes, you still might need today to export to a production class business rule engine. But as I say, in 5 years that probably won't be the case. Okay, so you have an end-to-end decision model created completely graphically with DRD and boxed expressions. And in the boxed expressions, all the text uses FEEL. And now the XML representation of this graphical model can be executed. So how do you do that? You start by providing values for all the input data elements. And the goal is to generate values for all of the decision nodes in the DRD. So a DRD, I would say, is a partially ordered. It does not prescribe an order of evaluation. You can do it sort of in a forward chaining way and a backward chaining way or something in between. So actually walking the DRD is the easy part of execution. So here's kind of a forward chaining way. You start by providing values for the input data elements, outlined in green, and then you create a list of all the elements, DRD elements that have values. Those are the input data elements to start, and then you also create another list of the nodes that are ready for evaluation, meaning that all of their information requirements are green. So there's two of those here, application risk score and required monthly installment. So pick one of those, let's say application risk score, evaluate it. Now it turns green. So we add that to the list of nodes with known values and create a new list of ready nodes. Now you've got these two in red, and you just progress this procedure, iterate this procedure until all the nodes are green. So walking the DRD in this kind of forward chaining way is actually quite easy. The hard part is evaluating the decision logic of a single node, particularly FEEL. And the reason is, or one thing that makes it hard is that FEEL has insisted, up to now, and I'd say it still does, insists that business friendliness means that the names of variables must be business terms, not things that look like programming variables. So names of variables in FEEL can contain spaces. They can contain operators like and or. They can contain symbolic operators like plus and slash and star. They can contain XML unfriendly characters like apostrophe. They can contain periods, which are also used as path operators. What a mess. I mean, I don't know why they're so insistent on that, but that's been the case. So, so here, for example, is a FEEL expression, you know, where abc.com.customerlist bracket, well, you see this. And so this first part, abc.com, is a namespace. How do I know that? Well, the model someplace says an import of that namespace. So the dot here doesn't mean a path expression, it's part of the namespace. Here at customer list, we know that's a variable name because it's one of the variables in scope. So we need to look at the information requirements of the node being parsed and see, yeah, oh yes, there's a variable there called customer list. And then whoever defined this variable customer list, in the type definition of that customer list, there's a child element or component called customer's first plus last name. So that's pretty diabolic. You say, what kind of an idiot would name a variable that? A business user, right? Because it's friendly. So the FEEL implementer is expected to parse this. So it means that every character you look at, you've got to look at names in scope, the type definition of the names in scope. I mean, it's I would say it's not impossible, it's just massively annoying. Okay? And so it's hard to do. And the grammar is really context dependent. I think that, understanding that, I think is what's led to some movement this week at the DMN 1.2. So I think we might find some improvement to this going forward in DMN 1.2, making it easier to implement. So that's part one of the hard part. The other hard part is the richness of the language. So implementers need to implement all of the built-in functions, operators, other features of the language, and map them, you know, to some other language that they can execute. So FEEL has 45 built-in functions, some of them tricky, like a string replacement using regular expressions, inserting an item in a list, date-time arithmetic, and sorting. So, you know, when you implement FEEL, you've got to be able to do all of those things. It supports invocation of user-defined functions, filter expressions, iteration, and more. So the benefit of all this, as I said, is you don't need to exit your value expression into BPMN or SQL or something like that to do iteration, to do table queries and joins, etc. So that's all a really good thing. All right, so as I said, 3 months ago, except for Oracle, the one who invented FEEL in the first place, nobody else seemed to have any interest in FEEL or box expressions. It was not business friendly, too hard to parse, too many built-in functions. They said if I wanted a programming language, you know, I use Java or UEL or something like that. And for me, the killer was always, our customers are not asking for this. Well, of course they're not asking for this. I mean, this is something that they've never been able to do before. How would they know to ask for it? I mean, it's like Steve Jobs saying, our customers are not asking for the iPhone. Of course not. Of course not. So, so instead, most vendors seem content to create DRDs, maybe simple decision tables, and then pass requirements to rule engine programmers. But that was never the promise, remember. The promise was what you model is what you execute. So I found that really surprising. So in the spring, it didn't seem to me all that hard. Now, it would seem that way to me because I'm not a programmer. Right? It's easy. So I'm not a programmer. So naturally, I set off to do it myself. So the only language that I know is XSLT, which is kind of an obscure language. It transforms XML to XML. But we started with XML, the serialized model, so that's a good thing. And the expression language of XSLT is XPath, and which is a superset of the FEEL built-in functions. So I thought, if I could parse it, I could probably map it. And so I set off to do this. So it looks like this. I create two transforms, LiveGen and DMN execute. And LiveGen basically maps FEEL in the DMN model to a library of XPath functions. And DMN execute takes a XML of the instance values, the input data, and in addition to the model itself, walks the DRD, including this function library, and generates XML output with each decision node has a value. So I said, that looks like a doable thing. I could do this. So here's in the DMN spec, there's a chapter 11 has a lending decision, end-to-end lending decision. It's not trivial. It's got invocations. It's got some other things. It's got context. It's got nested invocations. It's got the amortization formula. So it's not trivial. And I kind of cheated because I took the spaces out of all the names. So parsing it would be easier. So here's my serialization of that chapter 11 model example in the spec. And then when I use LiveGen, here's sort of a snippet of the function library. There's an ID for each sort of field expression and an XPath equivalent referencing the known values list. And here's the instance document. So it takes all the input data elements and provides a value. When you transform that with DMN execute, so here you get the list of all the decision nodes and their values. So I did this, not a programmer, did this, took me about 80 hours. So I said, that's not so hard, but like I said, I cheated because I took out the spaces of the names. All right, so I couldn't believe why the vendors were saying this was that hard because they actually have real programmers. All right, but I also realized nobody's going to want to use some two-step manual procedure in some obscure tool like XML Spy to do this. And so unbelievably, Trisotech volunteered to put my XSLT in the cloud using Saxon in their cloud, hosted in their cloud, and glued together the two pieces using some code I don't know. And so here you see that same thing. Here it is. We upload the XML file, upload the instance file, click execute, and you get the output. Very nice. Very nice. So that's kind of cool. But as I said, I cheated because I took the spaces out of the names. And after the last few task force meetings, I knew that we were never going to eliminate spaces from the names. So I was just going to have to bite the bullet. So on the DMN website, there is some official or quasi-official, I'm not sure what the status of it, there's a posted serialization of the lending decision. I'll start with that. But I realized when I started working with Trisotech that if the model was not valid, there's a possibility that their implementation would hang. My implementation would hang, and theirs would hang as well. That's not good. So you need to validate your model as part of this before you execute it, or else it's going to be a bad user experience. So validation has three levels. There's sort of a syntactical level, which is sort of pointers to nowhere. Then there's which you don't need any field parsing. There's another level down where you need to parse the field and see are the references in the value expressions actually to names and scope, or because any spelling mistake, difference in case, difference in space is going to make a mismatch, and the thing is going to hang. So it took me just about an hour to code the syntactical level validation. I applied it to this example on the website. 32 errors. So here's the lesson. The lesson: when you put spaces in names, it is 100 times easier to have typos that references and the reference element don't match. Okay? Certainly if you create XML by hand, which almost all tools are doing today because they don't export the XML. So the lesson is this should never happen because it's up to the tool vendor to make sure that serializations clean up all this junk, right? So you don't have these errors. All right, so this was sort of a fun exercise for me, but not what I really want to end with. What I want to end with is what's happening for real. So what's happening for real is we are seeing real DMN level 3 implementations. So Oracle showed it again at DecisionCAMP. A real implementation of FEEL and boxed expressions. Pretty nice. They don't have DRDs yet. It'll be released probably this year in some form as part of the Oracle Process Cloud Service. Tricitech has, as I mentioned, full box expression editor, FEEL editor. They don't have FEEL execution yet, but they will have it probably by this fall. Open Rules, Jacob's company. Open source. Full FEEL. He told me a week ago we don't support spaces in the names without some special syntax. Yesterday he said, oh, now we support spaces in the names. So that's open source. They don't have boxed expressions, but he is committed, sort of, to full level 3 implementation. Red Hat, Drools. Mark Proctor is here. He announced last week, yes, they are doing a full FEEL implementation, open source. It's almost ready, he says. Probably by this fall it'll be out. Open source under Apache license, so everyone can use it. The WFMC, this thing that Keith Swenson is organizing, it morphed from a reference implementation to a TCK, and that seemed to be much more sort of welcome to the vendors involved. So this will provide test cases, test suites, to help ensure conformance to the real level 3 standard. And that work is basically just getting started. I'd say in the also column, Sapiens Decision has told me privately they're planning to do a standalone DMN modeler, supporting FEEL in some fashion. I'm not sure it'll be complete, a level 3, with some mapping to TDM for production use. Signavio is level 2A today. That is, they can do a lot of sort of equivalent functionality, but with their own expression language. But they are moving. They're committed eventually to doing full conformance level 3. FICO has a full conformance level 2 editor today. I call them sort of on the fence as to whether they want to do FEEL or not. And here's their statement as of a couple months ago. But I think from what Alan's told me, hasn't changed too much from that. And then Camunda also is conformance level 2, and I'd say they're going to add DRDs, and they're on the fence whether they will do FEEL or not. So there's a number of vendors that either have it or close to have it, or are committed to doing it, or on the fence for doing it. So that is really exciting. So here's the bottom line. So 3 months ago, I was wondering whether the past year that I'd spent in these weekly calls with DMN were just a waste of time. And now I'm totally excited because it's really happening. So DMN, in spite of all these difficulties, is today a success story in the process of unfolding. The promise, which requires full implementation, is real. It's happening this year. We'll see real level 3 implementations this year from multiple vendors. And I believe that once that happens, the vendors that are on the fence or content with their level 2, level 1, will reconsider that strategy. Now, many of the heroes of this story are here at this event. So, Alan Fish, Gary Hallmark, Jan Ventinen was here yesterday, and you should all thank them. It's a fabulous thing that they did. And then some of the people that were there at the beginning went away and are now coming back. You know, Larry Goldberg, Jacob, Mark Proctor. That's really a good thing. That's really a good thing. That shows this is a real thing. It's happening, and that's really exciting. The momentum is building. So we're still trying to make it better. Still trying to make it better. So if you're interested in helping to do that, you should join the RTF. Talk to Gary. You should participate in the TCK. Talk to Keith. And if you want to learn how to use DMN, well, there's my book. I have a training class next week. Here's the links. You're welcome to do that. So it's very exciting. So I conclude by saying welcome to the new world of decision management, and thank you for your attention. So do we have time for questions? Questions?
I'm curious about the possible use of, since in some cases, in some real cases, complex relationships must be taken into account in the rules. So I'm curious about the use of first-order logic, about business friendliness, and the need for this, and the feasibility. Thanks.
So the need for business friendly person can understand the logic. Then there's a question of, how do we model that in the language? And there's, and there's trade-offs. You can have something which is more terse or sort of take more space in the model, but there's ways to do it. So without an actual example, I'm not sure I can answer that better. But a lot of the people that complain about business unfriendliness are kind of talking about logic expressions which are maybe more complex than business people would be concerned with anyway. So
the logic, first-order logic is more complex, but the way you write first-order logic expression is very simple. It's used also for teaching logic programming to primary school children, so shouldn't be so complex writing the rules.
okay.
The power and the complexity of the tool is higher.
Okay. I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's the best I can do.
Maybe related question is the variables current. So in principle, there's no real way to change rules. So if the whole logic becomes more complex, so there's multiple decision tables, you want to create some links between these decision tables, and maybe even you want to use different terms which basically mean the same thing, which is the case when you have, for
So you can chain these things together with the DRDs. That's essentially what they do. If you need to have different terms for the same thing, well, some people would say you should use a glossary and you shouldn't do that, but you do have this level of indirection in DMN with invocation. So you can make the reusable thing. It has its parameters, and they're named ABC, and the original decision calls those XYZ, and so the invocation maps XYZ to ABC. So there is a way to have different parts of the decision logic. You give different names to the same concepts, but you need to define this mapping. And the invocation already does that. So does that address your question?
Yeah, so that's the way how we do it, but then comes the maintenance question, of course.
The maintenance question.
It's very complex and change decision tables and take care of this.
So, I mean, when you talk about maintenance and maintainability of decision models, now you're outside of DMN, you're in the repository domain, the methodology domain, the business glossary domain. So this is where, tools are going to compete and win or lose, because every tool vendor has its own ideas about what those methodologies should look like, what those glossaries should look like, the governance aspects of that. And they're very important, I agree. DMN, I think, wisely stayed out of that. If it waded into that, it would probably make lots of enemies and not many friends. So, yes?
I would just want to point out that we consciously kept the expressive power of DMN very low, right? It has no logic variables, right? It has no recursion. It's actually, if you stick to the rules, it's not possible to write an infinite loop, right? So it's not Turing complete. And we found through practical experience many years with business users that, if you let them write, to know what they were doing. And so we just consciously wanted to reduce that to make it much safer for business users.
Yes.
Hope this won't rip off any scabs, but I'm wondering on the space issue, spaces in these issues, that, the typical way people handle this is that you have quoted strings. Users can usually deal with some kind of convention. So why doesn't that, first part of the question is, why doesn't that solve the problem, or why doesn't that?
We're moving towards that in 1.2.
We just didn't want to rub the user's nose into some of the ugly syntax, so to speak, right? But
You can have tools that'll shield.
exactly, that's I think so.
That was the idea.
Standard
That's
requires
the
it,
idea.
and therefore
Yeah.
facilitates the
Because-
implementation,
Right,
right?
we even say for quoted strings, users don't even like to see the quotes, right? So we say, the user interface, can and should strip those quotes off and say rendered in italics, right? Use some typographical conventions, right? And you
Sure.
saw a presentation from Dan from IBM, right, where they are allowing spaces, but then they render it as underlined.
Yeah, and you
Right.
see that in SPDR.
Yeah.
So
And so I think we want to try to move towards something like that if we can do that, in a dot release of the spec without, unduly, causing backward compatibility problems.
Since you're the only one who's already implemented it, you're the only backward compatibility worry we've got.
Rules is, I get that email from their developers, now a few times a week asking questions about the grammar. So, there are other parallel efforts going on. I wouldn't want people to be displeased if they went through the work of doing it and then say, oh,
Right.
sorry, we changed our mind. So, but if we could do it in a just somewhat to minimize the disruption, I think that would be good for everybody, good for adoption, good for everybody.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I wonder about the connection now between BPMN and DMN. So initially, one idea is that the boxes, the decision boxes in BPMN can be filled with DMN decision making. But do all use cases you found in BPMN now work with DMN?
Well, so BPMN predated DMN, obviously. So there is no explicit link between what they call business rule task in BPMN to DMN, although there are a number of BPMN modeling tools that work that way. Also, in the meta model now of DMN, it's a little messed up because the link is between BPMN task, probably decision task, business rule task, and a decision in DMN. It really should be with a decision service, which is another semantic element, since that's actually what's invoked. So yeah, that's kind of a minor thing. I expect that'll get fixed in 1.2. BPMN spec is not going to be changed. Okay, so even though there's hundreds of minor bugs, it's like we don't want to touch it. So it's going to stay the way it is. So there will be a de facto linking, but it won't be in the spec itself. Other questions? Yes.